there has been a pretty sharp shift in the balance of military power, and to the degree that China is at least somewhat confident that its relative military capabilities are going to improve in the future, then that certainly gives reason to be patient.
My name is Margot Landman, and I am Deputy Vice President for Programs at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's interview. Scott Kastner is a professor in the Department of Government and Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. His book, War and Peace in the Taiwan Strait, recently published by Columbia University Press, is the very timely subject of our conversation today. Moderating for us is Jessica Chen Weiss, the Michael J. Zach Professor for China and Asia Pacific Studies in the Department of Government at Cornell University. From August 2021 to July 2022, she served as Senior Advisor to the Policy Planning staff at the U.S. State Department on a Council on Foreign Relations Fellowship. Both Scott and Jessica are fellows of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. And Scott, what a pleasure to be able to read your new book. I learned so much. I highly recommend it. It couldn't be more timely and important, and really bringing a great deal of, rigor and strategic insight into the many dynamics that are making the Taiwan Strait so dangerous. At the same time, I think giving us, while understanding some of the causes of the rising tensions, also, I think, helpfully pushes back against the sense of inevitability without being necessarily rosy-eyed either. And so I just can't recommend this book highly enough, and it's really a treat to be able to talk with you about it to process some of its insights.
Thanks, Jessica. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about the book as well.
Absolutely. So let's just dive in. So first, I think you bring forward, some really valuable insights from theories of bargaining in war, which is chiefly that even in a zero-sum relationship, both sides, in this case, Beijing and Taipei, both sides have an interest in avoiding war, and I think that includes the United States. And so that implies that there is, some peacefully arrived at solution that is always preferable. But the question is, can that be located in? And even separate from locating one, all these years, there has been no war, although there have been many crises. And so does that mean that a bargain exists, or at least implicitly? And what are the characteristics of the status quo? And I think that you have provided a very helpful kind of diagram on what the status quo is, and what are those sort of pressures for moving away from it. So maybe could you describe, first of all, what is the status quo? How has it evolved? And what are some of the dynamics and pressures that are contributing to increasing tensions in the Taiwan Strait?
Sure. Yeah. So I think so. The status quo is clearly it's somewhat kind of dynamic, right? And it kind of changes over time in terms of kind of how the two parties kind of think about the current status quo in the cross-strait relationship. I think, kind of broadly speaking, you can kind of think of the current status quo as largely a situation where Taiwan enjoys de facto independence and de facto autonomy from the PRC, but where it lacks most of kind of what we would kind of think of as kind of the pieces of international legal recognition. Very few states have formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. It's not able to participate in most international organizations and so forth. And it's a status quo where Taiwan, even though it kind of enjoys de facto independence, meaning obviously it has its own government, which is democratically elected, it has its own military and so forth. It still calls itself formally the Republic of China, and it still has a constitution that dates back to the time when the Republic of China was based on the mainland. So it's kind of this ambiguous kind of situation where Taiwan enjoys this kind of legal or this kind of de facto independence, but lacks some of the trappings of kind of legal recognition and independence.
Great. Then can you talk a little bit about how the status quo has been in some ways redefined or moved, and looking at the various administrations on Taiwan, and as well as what might be China's shifting preferences as well?
Yeah, so I think that kind of the way that the Taiwan government under various administrations has kind of defined its relationship and kind of thought about its relationship with China has changed over time, right? So for years after the end of the Chinese Civil War, of course, the Republic of China government kind of viewed itself as the legal government, the rightful government of all of China, and kind of viewed the PRC as a completely illegitimate regime on the mainland. This all really changed pretty dramatically as Taiwan democratized, and increasingly there was kind of robust debate, an open debate in Taiwan about whether Taiwan should be kind of thought of as part of China in this way, and whether it should kind of think of itself as kind of the rightful government of China in this way. And so we've kind of seen movement away from that, where under Lee Teng-hui, for example, in the 1990s, the Taiwan government kind of basically outlined a position where it kind of conceptualized both sides as being kind of sovereign equals. Lee kind of talked about the relationship being a state-to-state relationship, or at least a special state-to-state relationship. And you saw kind of similar formulations under the Chen Shui-bian administration in the 2000s. When the nationalists came back to power under Ma Ying-jeou from 2008 to 2016, there was kind of some acceptance of, again, kind of this idea that Taiwan should be thought of as, in principle, at least a part of China, although kind of ambiguously. And then the current government has not been willing to kind of endorse this formulation, this idea that Taiwan should be thought of in principle as a part of China.
Great. No, thanks so much.
Sorry.
No. I think it's very helpful background, and we are, of course, heading into a new presidential election season in Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen is term limited, and so I think there's a big question around what will that future evolution of Taiwan's own conversation about its status and its sovereignty. What form will that take in the context of an election campaign? And so in the book, you look at two sort of sources of potential conflict, looking at first, well, not the drivers of, but the two parties here. So there's the Taiwan revisionism, quote unquote, and you have PRC revisionism, and you take those two in turn. I think that's a really elegant way of slicing into the many challenges that arise on both sides. So let's take first, I think, the question of Taiwan, quote unquote, revisionism, because I think it follows nicely from our discussion here of these shifting conversations. And so you argue, here that, Taiwan could inadvertently cross Beijing's red line for reasons largely due to excessive optimism that somehow the PRC is bluffing, or that war might even end with a positive outcome for Taiwan, like maybe they could finally get de jure independence in the context of a war. And you said that this scenario is relatively straightforward to prevent, because it's rooted in what we call information problems, or this sort of insufficient information about Beijing's true willingness to fight. And it could be relatively simply or straightforwardly addressed through costly signaling by Beijing and efforts by Washington to deter this kind of adventurism in the first place. And so I wanted to ask you, while the logic is straightforward, I have questions about whether or not we can count on such costly signals by Beijing to be interpreted accurately. So in the wake of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, we saw a series of exercises and missile tests, and I think those were largely understood as okay, this was not about a precursor to an invasion. This was about deterring or responding to what they perceived as a provocation. But in the future, how well will we be able to distinguish between efforts to deter and punish rather than precursors, preparations for an invasion?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think part of kind of the answer to that is I think it's kind of important to kind of look at the context of what the PRC is doing at a particular time. And so in this case, the PRC was kind of largely reacting to something that happened, right? And so I think that to the degree that you see kind of the PRC kind of reacting to events, it suggests kind of an effort to kind of signal kind of some sort of view about those events, and that in this case with the Pelosi visit, that there's a sense that U.S. I think it was kind of a signal, that an effort to kind of signal that there's a lot of concern about kind of where the U.S. Taiwan relationship is going. And this was kind of an especially kind of high profile episode that I think kind of served as a little bit of a focal point for kind of expressing some of that dissatisfaction. I'd be more worried if we kind of saw, kind of significant change in kind of what the PRC was doing, kind of in the absence of kind of some obvious kind of event or series of actions like that. So I think that's one way of kind of thinking about it. But in reality, it can be hard. I think that military experts argue that there are certain things that would probably have to occur for there to be kind of a credible invasion scenario that would likely be kind of noticeable. You'd see some kind of significant mobilization of forces and so forth. So there's stuff like that, but I think in general, it can be hard to kind of differentiate between when the PRC is seeking to kind of signal dissatisfaction with what Taiwan and the US are doing, and kind of basically kind of play to its kind of status quo goal of preventing Taiwan independence, versus PRC efforts to kind of advance its own revisionist goals of unification.
Great. And then I think the second piece of, preventing or this kind of red line scenario you suggested was Washington discouraging Taiwan revisionism. And so I wonder whether and to what extent you think we can count on Washington to play that role of deterring rather than supporting it.
Yeah, I think that it's somewhat unclear looking forward, given the nature of kind of where things have gone in the U.S. China relationship, and where things I think have gone politically in the United States with regard to the U.S. relationship with China. If we kind of look back, for example, to the Chen Shui-bian administration in Taiwan, where you had some pretty clear signaling coming out of Washington that there was really kind of a lot of dissatisfaction with some of the things that the Chen government was doing, that the U.S. saw as being kind of symbolic steps to kind of highlight Taiwan's otherness from China in a way that didn't accomplish anything concrete in terms of improving Taiwan's security. And so there was kind of concern at the time that Taiwan might, its actions were kind of contributing to tensions that could escalate and that could involve the United States ultimately. And so the United States became kind of increasingly critical of the Chen government, and increasingly openly so. And that was a time where I think there was kind of a widespread sense that the U.S. China relationship was not only a priority, but it was something that, there was kind of a sense that there were a lot of kind of positives to this relationship, and there was a lot of cooperation between the two sides on a range of international issues, right? Things like the North Korean nuclear issue, and you could kind of go on, right? And there were kind of concerns about the implications of a sharply deteriorating U.S. China relationship for other U.S. goals like the war on terrorism. In today's world, it's the U.S. China relationship has really kind of deteriorated so markedly, and there's so much kind of, I think, less clear cooperation between the two sides on a range of issues. And there's kind of this, I think, sense in the United States that we're kind of moving into a Cold War type environment, where I'm not sure that there's kind of that same counterbalance where there's kind of this kind of belief that it's important to kind of maintain stability in U.S. China relations, and to not let the Taiwan issue kind of become something that leads to a great deal of instability in U.S. China relations. So I'm a little bit concerned, kind of looking to the future, about kind of whether the U.S. would act as a constraint in the same way that it did, say, during the Chen Shui-bian administration.
Yeah. Let's turn now to the PRC revisionism, which I think is on a lot of people's minds in Washington. Here, the question is whether or not, Beijing believes that time is or is not on its side. Officially, the rhetoric is that yes, the wheels of history are moving on toward unification. Nonetheless, I think that there is a great deal of understanding that political trends and demographics on Taiwan make the idea of kind of a peaceful process, an uncoerced process toward unification, extremely unlikely. And so, interestingly, I found that you argue that despite this pessimism about trends on Taiwan and the trajectory of U.S.-Taiwan relations, PRC leaders may not necessarily decide that they need to act sooner than later. And I thought that was a really novel argument, and maybe you could say a little bit about why you're less pessimistic than others.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple of reasons for my, I would say lack of extreme pessimism, but still let's say concern about this possibility. But I guess I don't view it as inevitable by any means that you would kind of see conflict arise as a consequence of kind of a sense in Beijing that trends aren't on China's side. And so the couple of reasons are, one, that I think trends are somewhat ambiguous if you just kind of look at them in the aggregate. So yes, on the one hand, there are a number of trends that are very worrisome from looking at it from Beijing's perspective here, right? And these include trends in Taiwan's society and politics, where there's clearly very little interest in Taiwan today in anything resembling unification with the PRC. There's growing Taiwan-centric identity on the island, where in public opinion polls, right, or surveys, the large majority of respondents self-identify as Taiwanese rather than as Chinese, or even as kind of having dual identity. And there's also concern. There's concern about the long-term viability of the Nationalist Party in Taiwan, right, which has typically been more willing to accommodate PRC views, at least to some degree, on sovereignty issues. And there's concerns about the kind of the evolving U.S.-Taiwan security relationship, where there's worry that the United States is kind of moving closer toward kind of a more kind of significant and formal security relationship with Taiwan. And so these are all things that would contribute to a sense, I think, in Beijing that maybe time isn't on China's side, that Taiwan might be slipping away politically and socially, and that a closer U.S.-Taiwan security relationship might, over time, kind of preclude the possibility of coercing Taiwan into unification. On the other hand, there's other trends that are clearly in China's favor, and the most obvious, I think, is kind of the shifting balance of military power in the region. There's debate about whether that's going to continue into the long term, and so and not being a military expert, I don't want to kind of get too into the weeds on that, but certainly there has been a pretty sharp shift in the balance of military power, and to the degree that China is at least somewhat confident that its relative military capabilities are going to improve in the future, then that certainly gives reason to be patient. So I think there's some ambiguity in trends. And the other reason I'm not totally pessimistic about this kind of a scenario is that in order for it to make sense for Beijing to act sooner rather than later, Beijing has to be confident that a military solution is actually going to improve things, right? And it's going to kind of resolve kind of these concerns about long-term trends in the Taiwan Strait. And I think that unless Beijing is very confident that it would prevail in a cross-strait conflict and be able to kind of successfully unify Taiwan as kind of an endpoint of that conflict, it's more likely that an armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait would make the things that Beijing worries about worse from Beijing's perspective, right? So it would, even kind of further erode any kind of interest in unification with a PRC government that's kind of willing to actually use military force against Taiwan. And so I think it would kind of intensify some of the social and political trends that we see in Taiwan. And it would likely be reason for the United States to kind of step up its security commitments to Taiwan as well. So absent a very high level of confidence in Beijing that it could actually kind of succeed at unifying Taiwan by force, I don't think that use of military force kind of resolves these concerns about long-term trends in the Taiwan Strait.
I find that very persuasive, and also that it suggests that Beijing is more likely to engage in kind of costly signaling, but with even using military means, but that is different from a full-fledged assault or an invasion.
Right.
But I think that there's a question as to whether or not Beijing faces a similar challenge, even using military means short of invasion. In particular, because you write that if voters on Taiwan elect a more revisionist leader, Beijing will have itself to blame, at least in part, because despite Tsai Ing-wen's relatively cautious stance, at least in comparison to her past DPP predecessor Chen Shui-bian, she still has moved the status quo incrementally further away from Beijing's preferred outcome, particularly by declining to endorse the 1992 consensus or a one China framework. And so so that that you've had this sustained campaign by Beijing that in many ways I think that you write that voters in Taiwan may conclude that what's the point of being cautious? It only brings more punishment. And similarly in Washington, there's this sense that, well, most of what the United States is doing now is a response to Beijing's sustained campaign to isolate and pressure Taiwan. And so I wonder here then, again, looking at the strategic dynamic from Beijing's perspective, could you say a little bit more about the challenge that Beijing faces in signaling resolve, but also trying to make credible its efforts to assure voters in Taiwan and the world, frankly, that Beijing remains committed to a peaceful reunification or unification process that would preserve Taiwan's autonomy? In other words, this sort of duality between the importance of making credible threats, but also then in turn undermining efforts at credible reassurance, which are both necessary to deterring changes to the status quo.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of putting it. I don't think I could kind of state the dilemma that Beijing faces kind of better than you just kind of outlined. And it's a fundamental dilemma that Beijing has kind of faced for a long time in its dealings with Taiwan, right? So how can Beijing credibly commit itself or kind of signal to Taiwan that it's committed to this idea of kind of peaceful unification where Taiwan's some level of kind of Taiwan's interests would be kind of protected in the context of some sort of negotiated settlement, when it also kind of feels like it needs to signal strongly that it's prepared to use military force if Taiwan kind of moves away from China and tries to kind of formalize its independence, right? And so that kind of suggests that at the end of the day, Chinese interests are such that it's willing to kind of crush Taiwan if necessary. And so I think there's kind of concern that, right, that in Beijing that I think there's, let me just kind of put it that I think there's kind of a recognition that this dilemma exists and that there's no kind of easy way to resolve it. That I do believe that there's kind of a sense that the threat of use of force is really kind of critical, because there's kind of a recognition that in Taiwan, most people would support formal independence if they believed it could be achieved peacefully. And this really kind of drives Beijing's dilemma in this regard, that if there isn't this kind of underlying threat to use military force against Taiwan, that Taiwan would probably move toward formal independence. And public opinion is pretty clear about that, public opinion surveys in Taiwan. So I don't think there's an easy way out. of this,
Yeah.
frankly.
So I want to raise the question of symbolic politics, which doesn't play a great role in your story, and a frequent critique, which I frankly have also been subject to, is that these sort of rationalist models kind of overweight the rationality as compared to other factors, and I think that you deal well with the challenge of the symbolic nature of the goods here in dispute. Nonetheless, I think that there's a question as to, in the context of domestic politics and election campaigns, both in Taiwan and the United States, whether or not these symbolic gains can really be, safely assumed to not trump the kind of sort of pragmatism and what the strategic kind of stances that might make sense if you were to look at it in the way that you have. And so I wonder whether or not, how we might think about what's to come, in terms of Taiwan's own politics. You spent a little bit of time talking about Vice President William Lai, who's sort of considered the front runner for the DPP nomination, who previously called himself an independence worker, but of course has been more moderate since. What role might this, play, and to what extent are you, optimistic that the kind of the strategic pragmatism will be able to rein in these kinds of, efforts to stand on, principle, frankly, rather than, as we saw in the run up to Speaker Pelosi's visit, that the right thing to do is to stand up to Beijing, right? And if those are the terms on which these policies are discussed, it creates very little space for symbolism to be subordinate to pragmatism.
Yeah, no, I think that's well put, and so I'll just kind of begin by noting that I certainly don't kind of dismiss the possibility that that you could get a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and that would ultimately be rooted to a considerable extent in these kind of symbolic disputes that you describe, right? Because symbolism is really important, and identity is really important, and either a conflict that's rooted in kind of Taiwan's efforts to move further away from the PRC, that would be ultimately kind of a decision that's rooted in a sense of identity in Taiwan, that Taiwan's not a part of China. And to the extent that you have a conflict that's kind of rooted in a PRC effort to kind of advance unification coercively against Taiwan, that would be a conflict that's ultimately rooted in this kind of this idea that that Taiwan should be part of China, and that's very much kind of an identity type or kind of a symbolic type issue. And so I do view this as by far the most dangerous issue in the U.S. China relationship, and it's dangerous because at its core lies this kind of sovereignty dispute that is intractable in large part because of these kind of symbolic and identity issues. And so I don't by any means want to kind of diminish the degree to which this is kind of a dangerous dispute, and it's one that certainly you can imagine either side, all three kind of parties kind of doing things that for largely kind of symbolic or domestic political reasons that kind of intensify the prospects for conflict in the Taiwan Strait.
So following the 20th Party Congress, which gave Xi Jinping an unprecedented third term, we've seen signs of recalibration in Beijing's diplomatic posture, one that's much more interested in stability and improving previously strained relations. So, given the dynamics and the strategic logic you've laid out, do you see any signs that Beijing is interested in lowering the temperature across the Taiwan Strait?
It's hard for me to say. I think that there's My sense is that Beijing does not want kind of near-term conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And again, this is just kind of my, I don't have kind of any inside information about this, but just kind of reading kind of the situation in China right now. I think that that the Chinese government is kind of dealing with a lot of pretty significant challenges, especially with kind of the ending of kind of zero COVID and some of the economic challenges that China is facing right now. And so I don't think that there's a desire to see this issue kind of further aggravating or kind of adding to kind of the range of challenges that that the CCP leadership is kind of dealing with right now. So yeah, I think that there's a desire to kind of see kind of some stabilization of the U.S. China relationship, and it would be desirable, I think, from Beijing's perspective, to kind of see kind of some lowering of kind of some of the temperature relating to Taiwan.
So maybe before we wrap up, I could just ask you quickly then, if you agree that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait is not inevitable, what are some specific policy recommendations that could help avert a tragedy?
Yeah, so I think that it's so kind of looking at it from a U.S. perspective, I think that it's a balancing act that even and you've kind of written about this in some of your writing as well, Jessica, that there's kind of a need to kind of balance deterrence with reassurance, and in this case, on the one hand, I think it continues to be important for the United States to have a robust presence in the region, so that any effort to kind of resolve the Taiwan issue using military force by the PRC as a kind of a way of accomplishing the goal of unification is something that's seen as being a very, very risky proposition from Beijing's standpoint, right? Something that would be both very costly, but also have kind of significant probability of failure. So deterrence is really important, and that means not only kind of robust U.S. Presence in the region, but it also means kind of reaching out to and strengthening regional alliances and encouraging Taiwan to invest robustly in its own kind of defense capabilities. But the kind of the flip side of this is that I think Washington wants kind of a world where China also has kind of some stake in kind of a peaceful status quo, and you don't want a kind of a world where leaders in Beijing kind of believe that the status quo is so intolerable that there's really not that much to lose from pursuing conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And so I do think it's kind of important, and even though it's kind of been challenging with Xi Jinping's China, given some of China's own kind of foreign policies in recent years, I think it's important for the United States to seek cooperation where it's possible in the U.S. China relationship, and to kind of resist some of these kind of calls for more serious confrontation in the U.S. China relationship, such as kind of more widespread kind of scorched earth decoupling of the two economies and so forth, because I think that ultimately would mean that Beijing has kind of less to lose from a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So I think it's kind of a two-sided coin where deterrence needs to be paired with reassurances, but also kind of efforts to kind of make sure that Beijing's kind of getting something from a peaceful status quo.
Wonderful. Well, Margot, I don't know about you, but I benefited so much from this conversation. Thank you, Scott, for writing this book, for sharing your wisdom with the world, and for tackling such a thorny but important issue.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much to both of you. I don't know whether to be optimistic, pessimistic, pessimistically optimistic, optimistically pessimistic. Definitely a challenging situation. We really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I'd also like to thank the NCUSCR staff members behind the scenes who've made today's interview possible. We hope that those who have tuned in found the interview interesting and informative, and that you will join us for future National Committee programming. Thanks again, and goodbye.